Good evening, friends. It's a rainy, dreary, cold day outside. Inside it's warm, nice, and cheerful because my wife is doing some really good cooking today. We've had some good fellowship. We've got a man visiting with us. It's been a nice day. After the Lord answered my prayer, my first earnest prayer, if there's a God, help me. It wasn't long after that, very, very shortly after that I came across the Bible. It's a long story. I'm not going to share it here. But in a very unlikely way, I came across the Bible. And I opened it up, never read the Bible before, just kind of plopped it open. And it happened to open up to the book of Matthew. It's the first book in the New Testament. And so I just started reading. I knew God had done something for me. And the unlikely way that I found this Bible, I thought, maybe I should take a look. And I opened it up. Matthew, I didn't know Old Testament from New Testament. I read Matthew chapter 1, Mark, Luke, John, the first 4 books of the New Testament. And it was kind of surprising, too. I remember in Luke 6:35, it said, love your enemies. And I thought, where in the world does that kind of thinking come from? Certainly it's not the earth. And the last part of the verse said he's kind to the unthankful. Well, if somebody doesn't say thank you to me, I'm not very kind, and I didn't love my enemies. I hated them. And it was like a foreign language. It was in English, but I didn't understand what it was saying. But what I could discern as I read, Matthew's Gospel, then Mark, then Luke, then John, kind of a different angle on the same subject, the life and ministry of Christ, I could discern that in this man called Jesus, there were some good things happening. He was healing the sick, giving sight back to the blind. The men that couldn't walk, the lame guys, they were jumping up, rejoicing, raising the dead. The casting out the demons to people that have some mental challenges. And I thought, this is quite an unusual character. And the thing that puzzled me as I read is that people were trying to kill him. There were so many people that were angry because of these great miracles that he was doing. It didn't add up. And I didn't quite understand. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't penetrate it all. I got some things. And I even got the concept of praying. I could see it was good to pray. I wasn't quite sure what praying was. Today I just say talking to God as you open your heart to a friend. But back then, I was so numb to spiritual things. I was so desensitized by living in the world. I was just reading the Bible for the first time, and these truths, I could not quite wrap my mind around them. And I was still drinking. And I knew the Lord wanted to give me an experience. I believed at that point He was leading in my life, and I believed the Bible, somehow God was using the pages of this book to speak to my heart. And so, you got to have a relationship before God can really address some of the needs in your soul. And the answer to that prayer, it began the relationship. And as I read, I began to develop one. I didn't really know Christ. In Africa, they say 2 fellows in a ship. That's fellowship. You cannot see the man sitting beside you. You can just talk with him. And after a while, you get to know him. You're sitting in the ship for 2 or 3 weeks. Can't see him, but you talk to him. Well, God was speaking to me in the Bible, and my flawed, rusty prayers, I was kind of talking back with him. We were speaking together. And that was the beginning of a fellowship experience. Now, at that point, the Lord was able to introduce me to the concept of change. And at that point, never really thought about it. Never thought I needed to change. I was miserable, never attributed that to my decisions. And so one day, I'm drinking a beer and reading the Bible. And my kind of half prayer is that, Lord, I want to understand. I don't understand. Can you help me understand the Bible? Then I drink a sip of beer, continue to read. And that was the first time the Lord spoke to my heart about making some changes in my life. And I realized He didn't speak in an English, not in a voice that I could discern with the physical ear, But the ear of faith, I heard him very clearly say, it's the booze or the Bible. You got to choose. You can't have both. And that was a shock. Because I liked drinking. I liked the way it tasted. I liked the way I felt. I had no desire in the world to stop. I had graduated from, Budweiser and these American-made beers to what I thought were healthier beers, German beers and Dutch beers and Irish beers, not so many bisulfates and preservatives. Then I even raised the bar a little higher. I started making my own alcohol. No additives, no preservatives, no bisulfates, no anything. Just good homemade booze. And I just finished making, I think, 15 gallons of wine. I had a lot of beer, made. And then the Lord brings me to the decision. We call that conviction, right? He puts it on your heart. Now you know it's time to stop. This was early on too. I've been reading the Bible a very short time. This is early in the experience. But I knew the Lord was inviting me to come away from the booze and to understand, have a deeper understanding and relationship through the Bible. And then I had this thought, I wonder if I could wait and drink all that wine up, drink that beer, just drink it all up so I don't have to pour it out. I wonder if that'd be okay, just to wait a while. It might take me 3 months or 6 months or a year. And dear friends, I knew that wasn't pleasing to God. And it wasn't like a forced relationship. It was a mutually agreed upon position that this was not the best for my health, and I could see it. I knew it was causing a problem in my marriage. I knew it wasn't good for me physically. If you'd pinned me down, I might have said, well, my father died of lung cancer. He's also an alcoholic, and his liver was about shot. My wife, Darlene, her father died of cirrhosis of the liver. He was a full-time drunk. And I knew it probably wasn't the best for me physically. I was hedging those subjects because I didn't want to stop. I was justifying all the reasons why I should. And then that was it. And very weakly, weak as water, and very hesitatingly, I said, Lord, I don't want to stop, but I am willing to be made willing. I realized later that's a Bible principle, right? I am willing, but please give me just one jot, one tittle, one iota of a desire to stop, because I don't have one. And He did. He did. I don't know how long it was, because what I'm sharing, this is a long, protracted process. It was not an overnight victory on the booze. But it wasn't long, and I had the desire. God put it in my heart that I needed to stop. And I wanted to stop. I didn't have a strong conviction, but I had a weak conviction. And I wanted to stop. And I stopped for a day or two, then went right back. Then I stopped again. Went right back. Now there's a principle in the Bible, Proverbs 24:16. A just man falls 7 times and rises up. He continues, he keeps trying. I'm not saying I was a just man, but I was a man that kept rising up. Tried again, a week, I went right back to it. Maybe the next time was a month, right back. 2 months, right back. The times in between were getting longer, but I was still going right back to the booze. And it was hurting my family, hurting my relationship. Of course, it had consequences for my health. The thing is, when you're 35, the consequences, it's usually later in life. You drink, whatever you're doing, these negative health habits, they don't show up sometimes until your 50s or 60s. So the health consequences weren't as apparent as the challenge in the home. Nevertheless, it was there. I'd wake up with a hangover, and just got tired of that, but it wouldn't stop me. So I stopped. And I don't know, maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 months went by. Darlene and I were in the car, driving up North I-75 from Atlanta toward Chattanooga. And I got this terrible craving for a beer. I just had this irresistible craving. Now, if you've never been chained to some of these habits, alcohol, tobacco, these things, you don't really fully understand what a chain it can be, what a tug it can have at your heart. But I was driving up Interstate 75. I got this real desire to stop and get a beer, and I did. I saw an exit, and I started to turn off at the exit, and Darlene, the second I did that, she looked at me. Now, somehow wives have a sixth sense. They know when something's going on, right? She looked at me. She said, "What are you doing? Where are you going?" And I began to justify my course. I said, "Well, I'm a grown man. It's my money," and et cetera, et cetera. So I stopped, got some gas, went into the gas station, came back with a 6-pack of tall beers. And I pulled the first one out. And Darlene just was looking at me. And then as I opened it up, she started crying. And then as I put it to my lips, took the first drink, she's crying, and she said, "Oh, Lew, please don't drink that. I want to be in heaven with you." I almost took the fun out of drinking, but it didn't quite. So I drank one beer. It was another probably half hour before we got home. Drank second, drank third. And time we got home, Mentone, Alabama, that cabin we had built together in the woods. Out there was a garden that we had grown. Got out of the car, had kind of had an argument. Darlene went into the cabin. I walked up into the garden with a beer. And dear friends, that would be about the last one I would ever drink. As I'm sitting there in the garden, something happened to me. I was drinking this beer, sitting in the garden that Darlene and I had made. We had cultivated the soil, we'd planted the seeds, we were eating the food. We've been up there many years now. This is many years later. The cabin was finished that Darlene and I had built. She's inside. I'm up here in the garden. We've had a dispute, and there's a division between us. And I look up in the sky. Now it's probably midnight. It's a pitch black sky, thousands and thousands of stars. The moon just starting to come up, just barely on the horizon. I can't remember exactly, but I remember the moon and the stars. And then Psalms 8, verse 3 flashed into my mind. When I consider, then there are three things David lists. When I consider your heavens, it says thy heavens, your heavens, the work of your fingers, and the moon and the stars. And my dear friends, I was looking at God's heavens. I was looking at the work of His fingers, and I was looking at the moon and the stars. And I guess maybe I got somewhat of an experience like David. Although David wasn't out there when he was writing that as a prophet, he wasn't drunk. I was. Nevertheless, God was speaking to me through the book of nature. And as I looked at the cabin, my wife in there, my precious wife, we're about to celebrate 43 years of marriage. Yeah, praise the Lord. As I looked at the cabin, my wife seemed to be increasing in importance. And this 16-ounce beer in my hand seemed to be shrinking and didn't really seem important anymore. I was getting an accurate picture. I was getting my priorities readjusted by the simple principles that David expanded on in Psalms 8, verse 3 and 4. Of course, in verse 4, he asked the question, what in the world is man? What is man that thou art mindful of him? What is man that thou visitest him? What am I? Who am I to be the subject of God's love and patience and mercy and grace? And he helped me in the garden. He got my priorities. He was turning me from upside down to right side up. I could see the value of that precious wife in the cabin and the really absolute, yeah. And God gave me a change. There would be one other occasion that I would have a drink, and that was the last one. That was maybe well more than 30 years ago. But the Lord was working with me. He brought me to conviction on the subject of the booze. And I think that was a real first step in getting to know Him better and to understand the Bible. And it also put my my marriage on solid footing too. My wife and I, we gotten the victory over the alcohol and didn't know it at the time, but there were a whole lot of things God wanted to show us. He is good, loving, and kind. He is merciful. And there were a whole lot of things that He wanted to teach us and show us. But that was the beginning of my education in the things of God, to come away from the beer joint and engage with God in Bible study and prayer. My dear friends, I hope you have a nice evening. And if you're struggling with some of these things, well, I'd say take Psalms 8, read verse 3 and 4, get out there on a dark night with the stars up, ask God to speak to your heart as He spoke to mine.